When looking at our map of the United States, I've always wondered, what's with this panhandle? Actually, what's with all these panhandles? Why do the states have so many panhandles? Well, actually, by my count, there are six-ish panhandle states. It depends on how you define them. But these are the six that I think look pretty weird. So let's talk about them. Starting alphabetically with Alaska, what gives? Did America just not want Canada to have a west coast? Well, no. Back in 1825, Alaska belonged to the Russians, and British Columbia belonged to, well, the British. And they couldn't agree on their border. So they came up with a vague agreement that the border was about 56 degrees north. And then you could follow the mountains from there, and I'm pretty sure it would be clear. Spoiler alert, it actually wasn't. So in 1867, when the US bought Alaska from the Russians, they wanted to know, for real, where's the border? And it didn't help that there was a gold rush near the disputed area in 1897. So, in 1903, they decided to finally do something about it and composed a delegation of Americans, Brits, and Canadians to decide what channel and what mountains the 1825 agreement was even talking about. The Americans claimed that they had a firm strip of land along the coast, while the British Columbians claimed that they only got coastal islands. In the end, the Brits were more sympathetic to the American claim, and the final agreement was more in line with their proposal. But it was slightly more narrow. This is why Alaska's panhandle today nearly gets cut off in the middle near Mount Bernard. Next we have Florida. What would become Florida was originally part of the Spanish colony of La Florida and the French colony of Louisiana, with the meeting point being somewhere in the Panhandle. This meant that the Panhandle was traditionally part of a different empire and culture than mainland Florida. Then the 7 Years' War happened, and they were both owned by Britain as East and West Florida. Still not together though. During the Revolution, both Floridas remained loyal to Britain. However, being small and only being part of the empire for about 30 years at this point, Britain was comfortable handing them both over to the Spanish in 1783. Now we still have two Floridas, only they're Spanish. The border between the US and West Florida in particular was unclear, and many Southerners were moving in to what was technically Spanish lands at the time. This would be an issue later. Just know that most of these settlers were from Alabama. In 1810, the West Florida Republic declared independence and was almost immediately annexed by the United States. This wasn't the West Florida we're thinking of yet, but it set a standard. Florida would join the US. And so it was. In 1822, when Spain gave America both East and West Florida, the US merged the two Floridas into the Florida Territory and thus solved the issue for a whole 5 minutes until Alabama decided it was going to spend the next 80 years trying to get that coastline. But then Florida just kept keeping the panhandle, and in 1901 they gave up and the issue was finally dropped. Next up we have Idaho. This one's pretty straightforward. In the 1850s, what is now Idaho was part of the Washington Territory, but then Washington became a state. Washington didn't want the panhandle because their population was coastal, and they thought it would be hard to administer the rough interior from the coast. So now, in 1863, we have the new Idaho Territory, and it is big, including what is now Montana and Wyoming too. Or at least it did for a year until Montana got to be its own territory. And they got to pick the border. So they chose the Bitterroot Range, giving Idaho its eastern border and its panhandle. So now Idaho had to manage the rough northern terrain. At least they still had Wyoming, which they would keep for about 5 years until it was taken away from them too. And real quick, if you're enjoying this video, please leave a like or a comment about how Wyoming still rightfully belongs to Idaho, or something along those lines. Anyways, back to the show. Now we reach Maryland, but I already made a whole video about this one, so you can go and watch that. I'll leave a link in the description. But in short, it's because Catholics. Okay, Oklahoma is up. Starting from the beginning, what is now the Panhandle was part of Texas. But then Texas joined the Union, and now it's part of America. Great. The only problem was the strip was north of the 3630 line from the Missouri Compromise, so Texas had a choice to make: either outlaw slavery in a small, faraway part of the state or give up the Panhandle. And I think we all know which one they chose. So now it belongs to Oklahoma, right? Well, no, Oklahoma isn't even a state yet. The strip spent about 40 years as the Public Lands Strip, more frequently called No Man's Land, which much better name. During this period, there was a lot of debate over who did or should own the strip, from the Cherokee tribe to squatters who had just moved in. During the 1862 Homestead Act, the strip was actually not eligible because the land hadn't been surveyed yet. However, after relentless government lobbying, the land was opened to settlement in 1889 and made its own territory, potentially to one day maybe be a state, but this was a bit of a PR campaign with claims that there were over 10,000 people ready to settle the land, but the actual number was maybe 2,000. And so in 1890, the next year, they decided that this sparsely populated strip should actually not be its own territory and gave the land to Oklahoma. So, Panhandle. But this happened after slavery was banned in Texas, so it seems weird that it wouldn't go back to Texas. Any Texans can feel free to air out their grudges in the comments section below. Alright, last but not least, the double panhandles of West Virginia. So way back in the colonial era, there was only one Virginia, and that Virginia claimed its borders to be at the Ohio River, which conflicted with Pennsylvania's claim. So they agreed their border would be an extension of the Mason-Dixon line, which already existed, for an additional 5 degrees west, and then they would follow the Ohio River from there. The only problem is maps at the time were terrible, and the Ohio River was actually 65 miles north of where they thought it was. So, Panhandle, in the north. Then a lot of nothing happened until the Civil War, when Northwest Virginia seceded from regular Virginia, taking the state's beloved northern panhandle with it, and also creating a second panhandle in the east, entirely by coincidence. And thus West Virginia was born with 2 panhandles. If you made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and consider subscribing for future content.